This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the best all-in-one platform for any of your website building needs. Hey guys, it's Celestia, and as many of you know, I'm a primarily self-taught artist. That's not to say I've never pursued any art education. I took a lot of art classes in high school and have been very involved in the online education scene ever since graduating, taking tons of courses through Skillshare and Domestika, as well as seeking out one-on-one mentorship through the now closed Jing Sketch Art Clinic. When I say self-taught, I really just mean I was too poor to go to art school and had to find alternatives. And while a lot of those alternatives have been surprisingly fantastic, like those I just listed, the downside of self-education is that they definitely weren't all quite so great. Like many, I didn't start off taking formal online courses. I started off by using step-by-step how to draw books, copying references, and following video tutorials on YouTube. Some of them, I will admit, taught me some very valuable lessons, and some even managed to impart some limited but still valuable understanding of the fundamentals of art. But for the most part, the longer I study and grow as an artist, the more time I actually spend unlearning what they taught me rather than utilizing it. And in fairness, there are a lot of reasons for that, not limited to the one that this video is going to discuss. A lot of those resources were made by amateurs who weren't skilled or qualified enough themselves to be teaching. A lot of the materials many of them were teaching were limited and poorly explained, and a lot of others were targeted at absolute beginners and therefore had to massively oversimplify and dumb down the concepts that they were explaining. But the tutorials and references themselves were only partially to blame for my failure to learn how to draw properly from them. As much as I would rather absolve myself of all responsibility, I can't, because what's much more relevant to today's topic is that I was part of the problem. The way I was using these tutorials and references to study and learn was, as I only realized years later, wrong, or at the very least, counterproductive. And it was wrong in a way that a beginner wouldn't realize was wrong at all, which is precisely why I didn't for so long. It's an approach to self-education that a lot of beginners take, but don't have the experience to recognize as flawed or detrimental. And I personally failed to realize exactly how long-lasting and deeply rooted its effects on my artistic growth had actually been until recently. In fact, it wasn't until I was talking with a friend about stylized anime hair highlights in art and how I do mine a few months back when I realized that the way I had approached tutorials and references since I started drawing as a baby beginner left me with no answers to their questions. Why do you draw them that way? Well, because I learned it from this tutorial ages ago. Yeah, but why did they draw it that way? Why does it look good? Why does it look wrong when I do it or change this aspect of it? Objectively speaking, I now have the skill and experience to analyze both my work and that tutorial and find the answers to those questions. In fact, I'm going to, later on in the video, to give you a real-time example of how I was using references and tutorials wrong. But back when I followed that tutorial and started implementing the techniques it taught, I didn't. Not only did I not have the skill to answer those questions, in fact, I didn't have the foresight to ask them in the first place. I saw the way the artist rendered hair, liked it, watched their tutorial on how they did it, and copied them. I didn't ask myself why they rendered it that way because I didn't need to know in order to replicate it. And that, as you may have guessed, is precisely the problem with this approach to tutorials and references that so many beginners share. The motivation is to learn to replicate an artistic technique or outcome, not learn to understand how it was achieved or why it looks good. The consequences of this misguided prioritization are much wider reaching than I originally realized. And when I really sat down and thought about my own artistic journey and how much I had unwittingly let it hold me back over the years, I decided the issue was an important enough one that I wanted to make a video about it. That's because I sincerely believe that especially now that short-form content is at the forefront of art self-education online, with really short, oversimplified tutorials becoming the standard, more and more beginners are taking that same approach to tutorials and references that caused me and so many others so many problems. And maybe if I can bring more attention to those problems, I can save at least a handful of them from being held back by them like I was. That in mind, in today's video, I will do my best to explain how you might be using references and tutorials so wrong that they're doing you more harm than good, all because you're trying to imitate rather than understand. But first, let me take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Squarespace, a longtime partner of the channel. Such a longtime partner, in fact, that when a video of mine starts without me giving them a shout out, people get concerned for my physical well-being, because it's just assumed at this point that there needs to be something majorly wrong for me not to gush about them at every opportunity. And honestly, good. If there's any sponsor I'd want to be that aggressively and passionately associated with, it's Squarespace, because they're the best website building and hosting platform out there in my objectively correct opinion. I would know, having built both my personal personal Duchess Celestia portfolio site and the site for my art studio Royal Starship Studios using some of their many versatile web design templates. One look at their extensive library of high-quality dynamic templates will tell you right off the bat that they have one that's perfect for whatever you need to build. Whether you want to make a gorgeous portfolio, an online store, a blog to share your thoughts, a landing page for your business, or literally anything else at all, there is a perfect Squarespace template waiting for you to use. Editing them is just as easy with Fluid Engine, Squarespace's next-generation editing system that lets you customize every aspect of your site with its smooth, user-friendly drag-and-drop interface. Taking it one step further and turning your site into an online store is just as easy with their e-commerce and print-on-demand integration, letting you sell everything from physical goods to digital content and letting your customers pay with anything from credit cards to PayPal and Apple Pay, and in eligible countries, flexible long-term payment alternatives like Afterpay and ClearPay. And that's not all. With SEO options designed to get your site to reach as many eyes as possible, visual design tools that help you build brand recognition, social media account connectivity, and so much more, Squarespace has tools to make every step of the web design and hosting process easy. And you can find out yourself by going to squarespace.com/Duchess Celestia, linked in the description, and use code Duchess Celestia for 10% off your first domain purchase. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video, and please go check them out. All that out of the way, let's get into the video. As I mentioned earlier, I and many other artists of varying skill levels have been using both references and tutorials wrong for one primary reason: our perspective when it comes to approaching them in the first place. More specifically, the difference between our desire to imitate versus our desire to understand. For tutorials, this difference is the deciding factor between whether we end up learning something significant enough to advance us in our artistic journey, or just how to imitate one aspect of someone else's. And for references, it's the difference between learning how to replicate how a reference looks in one photo versus how the subject matter of that reference looks in any setting. In both cases, it boils down to the difference between replicating the way something looks and understanding why it looks that way. And in both cases, if you're not consciously aware of how that difference impacts your learning, it may end up severely and consistently hindering your artistic growth over time. Something I unfortunately learned firsthand after spending years holding myself back without even realizing it. While the same underlying problem applies to both tutorials and references, I'll be giving one individual example for each to thoroughly illustrate exactly how, starting with the former. When it comes to tutorials, to explain how they're so frequently used wrong, I first have to break them down into two categories: educational tutorials and stylistic tutorials. I went over this once already in a previous recent video discussing, in part, why I don't make art tutorials myself, linked in the description and the iCard above. But let me quickly summarize the points I made there, here. In almost all cases, any given art tutorial can be categorized as one of those two types, although the differences between them may not be immediately clear if you don't know how to recognize them or what to look for. Even so, establishing what category any given art tutorial falls into is exceptionally important when it comes to deciding how to approach it when including it in your study plan in any capacity. So let's go over the key differences between the two so that you know what to look for when curating your personal library of tutorials to learn from. An educational tutorial is one that effectively serves as the foundation for your art education, teaching you artistic fundamentals that have a wide range of practical applications throughout all forms of art, regardless of subject matter or stylization. These are tutorials that aim to explain the core principles of art, things that, regardless of what you're drawing or what style you're drawing it in, will always be applicable and accurate. To give an example, while a stylistic tutorial might be titled How I Draw Faces, an educational tutorial might be titled Understanding Facial Anatomy Using the Loomis Method. While the former may answer the question of how to draw one thing in one style, the latter will answer the question of why that thing looks that way in any style. Educational tutorials provide artists of all skill levels with the building blocks that they need not just to make art, but to understand why the techniques that they're using to do so are effective at making it look right. Conversely, stylistic tutorials, for the most part, do not. They generally operate under the assumption that anyone utilizing them either already understands the fundamentals of art or doesn't care to, because one way or the other, their goal is not to explain them. Whereas an educational tutorial aims to teach you why certain techniques are effective in any number of settings and styles, a stylistic tutorial aims to teach you how one specific technique can be utilized in one specific setting and style. And that really is the biggest difference between them. One teaches you how to draw something, while the other teaches you why that method works. Based on the earlier example, one would teach you the rules on how to draw any human face in any style, while the other would only teach you how to draw a face in that artist's style, generally without explaining why they draw it that way in their style, and only how. Some stylistic tutorials do explain the fundamentals to some degree, generally in terms of how it applies to what they're stylizing. So if they're teaching you how they draw faces, they may explain how they built upon their existing fundamental understanding of faces to stylize and exaggerate certain elements while still following those universal rules. Even so, I would be inclined to say that those are the minority minority, with the vast majority simply electing to, as I mentioned earlier, assume that anyone watching either already knows those rules or doesn't care about learning them and only wants to know how to imitate their style rather than why that style looks good. And that ultimately is the problem that this boils down to when it comes to how you approach each one. If you already understand the fundamentals, you can look at a stylistic tutorial and understand why the artist making it made the choices that they did, what universal rules they followed and what creative liberties they took with them, why the techniques they utilized were effective, and so on. But if you don't already understand the fundamentals, you'll only learn how to emulate those techniques and choices, meaning that what you're learning is not how to create art necessarily, but how to imitate existing art, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but let me elaborate. As I'm sure you've gathered by now, when I say that artists are using tutorials wrong, I don't mean educational tutorials. It's pretty difficult to misuse an accurate educational tutorial to the point that you don't learn from it, since what they teach is universally applicable. The tutorials that artists, my past self included, are using wrong are almost exclusively of the stylistic variety, but the stylistic tutorials, contrary to what you might think, aren't really to blame for that misuse. Our approach to them is, at least if our goal is to learn and make meaningful progress towards growth as artists. After all, we can't blame a tutorial that isn't aiming to teach us the fundamentals for not teaching us the fundamentals. Their goal isn't to educate others on universal art rules, but rather to teach them their particular method of breaking, revising, or reinterpreting them, with the assumption that they already know them. It's on us to learn them first so that when we watch those tutorials to learn from individual styles that inspire us, we understand why those styles work based on them. The problem is that in many cases, all tutorials are viewed as the same with the same value and the same approach, without any differentiation being made between the two categories. After all, if artists don't know how to differentiate between an educational tutorial and a stylistic tutorial, they won't know the value of studying one before the other, or at least altering their approach to studying each one based on which category it falls into. And we've already established now how to differentiate between them. Now let's move on to how to approach our method of studying them based on that differentiation. Stylistic tutorials tempt many beginners with the illusion of simplicity. When it can seem too daunting to learn facial anatomy, it's tempting to instead simply follow a step-by-step tutorial on how to draw an anime face in a style you like. I did. Now I have a multitude of issues with drawing faces, but that's kind of my point. Anyway, you can follow those steps and achieve that result relatively easily, giving you the feeling that you learned something and developed more skill as an artist than you really did. It's hard to learn the fundamentals in their entirety, much less all of their practical applications in your own work, but it's easy to bypass them entirely with the ease of simple shortcuts provided by stylistic tutorials. You don't need to know how far apart the eyes need to be from each other or from the nose, or where the mouth should be in relation to the nose, or how those proportions appear differently from different angles or perspectives. You just need to follow those steps and you'll be able to draw a face that looks right, but only in that one setting, from that one angle, in that one style. Because ultimately that's all you learn, imitation. You're taught how to utilize certain artistic techniques, but not why they work. So all you take away from that is how to use them to copy the original tutorial's subject matter and style. You can't glean any understanding as to why they broke or reinterpreted certain artistic rules if you didn't learn those rules yourself first and they didn't explain them. So there's immediately an unspoken cap placed on how much educational value you can actually derive from that. To some extent, it does boil down to that old argument of learning the rules before you break them. A widely known piece of art advice that I only half agree with. Personally, I think you should learn the rules while you break them, because forcing yourself to learn all of the fundamentals before making any stylized work, when stylized work is all that you want to draw, may very well sap all of the joy out of creating art for you at all. I maintain that same perspective when it comes to how you approach tutorials. Some might advise that you exclusively study educational tutorials until you understand the fundamentals, and only then move on to incorporating stylistic tutorials that explain different ways to break the rules that you already now know. I would personally encourage a little more lenience, because I know that for many, that takes the fun out of art and pushes a very linear path of art education that might not be the right fit for everyone. Instead, I would argue that if you understand the core differences between the two when it comes to what they teach, you can study both simultaneously, but differently. Educational tutorials can be trusted to teach you universal rules regardless of how you approach them, but stylistic tutorials should be approached with the constant question of why. So long as you're watching them and always questioning why the techniques utilized are effective, they can be useful educational tools when it comes to learning why certain styles look good and how to achieve similar looks in your own work without directly copying the style of the artists who made them. Furthermore, while I brought up the illusion of simplicity as a negative before, I'd be remiss not to mention that it does double as a positive for beginners. As I've said, the fundamentals can be really daunting to beginners. There is so much in art to learn, to the point that regardless of your skill level, there will always be more that you don't know yet and need to study and practice. And that can be so monumentally overwhelming that some may feel so intimidated that they choose not to start learning at all. While a step-by-step tutorial on how to draw an anime face in one artist's style might not have any real educational value in terms of providing them with a universal understanding of how to draw faces, it's so simple and easy to follow that it might help them build confidence in their ability to draw specific faces in specific settings. And the more confident they become, the more equipped they will eventually feel to tackle more difficult fundamentals that will help them further develop their skills. This is what I mean when I say that art education isn't linear or one size fits all, because in that case, learning the rules before they break them would have turned that artist off of art altogether. While some kids may be the prodigious exceptions, we generally don't send children who don't know how to ride bikes off to learn through trial and error. We recognize that the prospect of skinned knees and broken bones would likely put them off the idea, and instead give them training wheels so that they can build the confidence they need to eventually feel comfortable taking them off. If beginner artists are using simplified, step-by-step stylistic tutorials to build that confidence before moving on to tackling the fundamentals, we should be encouraging that, not demonizing it. And if all they want is to draw with those training wheels on forever and they're satisfied only knowing how to emulate those tutorials rather than understanding why they work, that's fine too. The problem only arises if they do want to grow past that and develop that understanding, but are consulting exclusively stylistic tutorials to teach them how to do so. Because not only will they not be able to understand why the stylistic techniques they're emulating are effective, that lack of understanding will severely inhibit their ability to put their own spin on how those techniques are implemented. When studying with the goal of imitation rather than understanding in mind, you'll struggle immensely to develop your own style using the techniques that you learn, instead only developing an ability to emulate someone else's. Remember when I said I'd give an example for both references and tutorials when it comes to establishing the difference between learning to imitate versus learning to understand? Well, both come from my personal experience, and that very dilemma brings me to the first of the two. When I was first experimenting with rendering hair, I used a stylistic tutorial to teach me how to do highlights. It's been way too long for me to remember which one, but I do remember that it taught me to make a block of highlights across the hair like this, erase it in areas of shadow, and then blend both of the ends of the highlights like this. I learned how to imitate that style, and I used it for years to come without any understanding of why the original artist who made the tutorial used those techniques. I knew how to do highlights like that, but not why that technique was effective. Several problems resulted from that. One, because I didn't know any of the fundamental rules that the original artist was breaking, I didn't know how to break them effectively in a similar fashion outside of the original setting. So I knew how to apply those hair highlights to a character in the exact way the tutorial taught, but not beyond that. I was limited to 3 basic steps. Apply a highlight to the middle upper section of the head, erase areas of shadow, and blend either end. But why was I applying highlights to only that top middle section of the head in that area? How would I apply them to other areas, and based on what criteria? Those were questions I didn't think to ask as a beginner, and tutorials meant I didn't have to. I could just apply the same highlights to every piece, not knowing that different light sources would mean utilizing that technique differently. I didn't learn why those highlights were placed in particular areas, so I basically just eyeballed it every time. I mean, you look at anime hair and you see the highlights generally placed somewhere in the middle of the hair, right? So you do that. You don't necessarily question why. In reality, those highlights are placed based on what part of the hair is the most voluminous, because that's the area that light hits the most. The part of the hair that sticks out most is where the highlights should be, which is normally somewhere in the middle, which is why that's the most frequent placement in tutorials. But without knowing that that's why, you're placing those highlights based on guesswork rather than an understanding of the light source, which means you don't have the knowledge to adjust your placement based on different light sources as needed. There are other things I failed to learn simply through imitating this tutorial too. For a long time, as you can see, I was blending both sides of the highlights equally, presumably because the tutorial I consulted didn't explain how or why to blend either, just that you should blend them. But if you actually look at how real hair looks when the light hits in a similar fashion, you'll see that the top side should be blended much more and much more softly, while the bottom should be blended more subtly to maintain a harder edge, because the bottom represents the most voluminous point of that block of hair. The hair past that point, decreasing in volume, is immediately hit with less light, hence the harder edge on the bottom compared to its more blended counterpart above that's hit with gradually more light up until that highest point. But I didn't know that, and I was blending both equally at random simply because that's what the tutorial did, and placing those highlights randomly without regard for where the light source would actually dictate they be placed. Furthermore, even when I did learn to start doing that more consciously and blend the top more than the bottom, my placement of shadow was still at the bottom of each particular clump of hair rather than directly beneath those highlights as it would be based on its light source's interaction with it, because I didn't learn how light would interact with it. I just followed a new tutorial on hair highlight rendering that I thought looked better. If you asked me why I was doing that, I wouldn't have had an answer, which was the root of a lot of my problems. Another tutorial after that then told me to start applying a shadow directly beneath those highlights, which I naturally implemented and thought, hey, that looks pretty cool. All still without understanding that light source interaction that explained why it looked pretty cool, because shadow, in most cases, immediately follows the highest, most voluminous point in the hair that accumulates the most light. If I'd known that, I could have better applied that knowledge to more accurate placements of highlight and shadow in a wider variety of settings. But because I only knew the how and not the why, I was only able to imitate the technique I learned in one setting, rather than apply it to a multitude of different settings with an understanding of why it worked in the first place. And not only was I limited in terms of how well I could implement that technique and what settings I could do so in, I was also limited in my ability to make it my own. After all, I didn't know why it worked. I didn't know what the rules were that the initial tutorial was breaking or bending, so I didn't know how to further break and bend them in my own way with that as a starting point. I didn't watch the tutorial with the intention of completely copying the style of the artist who made it, although I do acknowledge that some artists do. My goal was to implement their techniques in my own work and put my own creative spin on it. But without understanding why those techniques were effective, I couldn't put that creative spin on it without risking effectively ruining them. To expand upon that previous example to clarify what I mean, let's look at the hair highlights again. As I said, the tutorial taught me to put the shadow directly below the highlights, which was a stylized method based on the universally applicable fundamental of light interacting with that form. They may be exaggerating the way that light interacts with that form and interpreting it in their own way, but they were still following the rules of how it does, that being in how the light is harshest and strongest at the most voluminous point in the hair and how shadow begins as that volume decreases. That's why they stylized it in that way. But because I didn't know that, I could interpret that as nothing more than a stylistic choice, and if I decided to put my own spin on it without understanding the fundamental that it was originally exaggerating, I could decide, okay, let's put the old Duchess Celestia spin on this and put the shadow above the highlight. Monumental. A unique reimagining of the original technique, sure, but also fundamentally wrong in a way that I wouldn't understand or even recognize without knowing why the original technique was the way it was. If I did, I could put that creative spin on it without altering it in a way that made it technically incorrect, like these examples that maintain the universal rule of that shadow directly following the highlight, while still consisting of other unique elements that are my own, informed by the tutorial but reinterpreted through my own creative lens. Without that understanding, I was left to hold myself back quite severely, because I didn't know why all of my attempts to diverge from the original tutorial looked wrong. I couldn't even have told you why the original tutorial looked right, because I hadn't thought to ask why before following it, much less actually find out. Had I approached the tutorial with a desire to understand rather than imitate, something I would have known to do had I understood the significance of the difference between educational tutorials and stylistic tutorials, I could have developed a more well-rounded grasp on not just how to apply certain techniques, but when and why, allowing me to utilize them in any setting effectively and revise and add to them in ways that were both uniquely my own and still fundamentally correct by way of following the universal rules that the initial tutorial was based on. Moving on from that ridiculously long-winded and unnecessarily convoluted explanation, let's now discuss how that same approach of learning to imitate rather than understand can negatively impact an artist's use of references in the same way it can tutorials. Fortunately for both me who's sick of writing this script and you who's probably sick of hearing me ramble, this is much more straightforward and requires much less explanation, largely because we've already gone over the biggest talking points. When an artist seeks out a reference for a piece, it's generally with one goal in mind: to use that reference to draw one specific thing in one specific setting. And by no means is that a bad thing, to be abundantly clear. That's exactly what references are for, and I don't mean to suggest that seeking out references purely to utilize them for one single use in a piece is a mistake. References are a versatile tool with a multitude of beneficial different uses, and direct imitation is absolutely one of them. It is worth considering, however, that knowledge of the fundamentals is still relatively necessary to imitate them effectively. For example, you can imitate a reference of light hitting metal armor to draw your character in metal armor, but if you don't have adequate knowledge to find the right reference of how light would hit armor in that specific setting of that piece, it will still look wrong. Accurate to how the reference looks in the image you consulted, yes, but not accurate to how it would look in your piece. And that's the biggest thing to consider when you're gathering references you intend to directly imitate in your work. Just as tutorials and shortcuts aren't a substitute for knowledge of the fundamentals, references aren't a substitute for knowledge of why they appear how they do. Let's say you're consulting a reference that you intend to directly imitate in your piece. The reference image is of a sweater that you're drawing your character in, but it's one of those Pinterest images that's like very clearly a listing for a clothing item available for sale on some other website, and is subsequently lit from like every direction so that you can see it as clearly as possible. But your character isn't lit that way in the piece you're drawing, so imitating that reference of the sweater directly, while accurate to the reference itself, won't do you any favors in making your piece look right if you don't reinterpret it with that context in mind. You can absolutely use it as a reference to imitate how the fabric folds and interacts with the human form beneath it, but you'll need to consult other references and your own knowledge to properly depict how that sweater would look in the alternate lighting of your own piece. Utilizing reference for imitation saves sake is not, on its own, a problem, but doing so without giving further consideration to the context of that utilization might end up being more detrimental than helpful. Even a perfect one-to-one recreation of a reference is gonna look wrong if it's not adapted to the same setting as the rest of the piece that it's used to create. And if you don't want to worry about figuring out how to reimagine the reference that you're consulting in that setting, then you instead have to use judgment informed by understanding of the fundamentals to compile references that look exactly how they would in that setting in the first place. Either way, you still need that understanding at the core of it all, regardless of the option that you choose. Essentially, even when you're using reference for the sake of imitation rather than understanding, that imitation still needs to be informed by understanding for it to be accurate, something that a lot of beginner artists fail to consider. In my experience, this was particularly problematic for me when it came to hands. I would look up references of how hands looked in certain positions to imitate in my own work, but with limited knowledge of anatomy, I didn't understand that those hands couldn't just be slapped onto the poses I was drawing my characters in. I knew how I wanted the pose to look, and I knew how the hand looked in the reference, but I didn't have enough experience drawing human bodies yet to know that the hands in the references wouldn't look that way on a real human posed that way. Because you can't just haphazardly slap references together and come up with something realistic looking without an understanding of what actually is realistic in the first place. It once again boils down to the same difference of perspective and intention that we've already discussed, the difference between imitation and understanding. That line is a little more blurred when it comes to references than it is with tutorials, because there absolutely is a place for direct imitation when it comes to references, so long as that imitation is informed by fundamental rules. But it's still fairly limiting if that's the only way you're using them. Yes, there are many instances in which direct imitation of a reference will allow you to accurately and realistically complete the piece that you're using it for. But if that's all that you're using it for, the amount that you stand to actually learn from doing so is limited. It comes down to asking the same question, not how to draw the thing based on the reference, but why it looks that way in the reference in the first place. The more you start asking yourself why rather than how when it comes to studies in your art, the more you'll learn. When I was Googling hand doing peace sign in my early days of drawing cute anime girls, not that that's still not what I'm drawing, I mean, look at my art, I was able to draw accurate hands drawing peace signs, but I was still left Googling every single hand pose I needed for every piece I made because I still had no understanding of why a hand making a peace sign looked like that. When I actively examined those hands, looked at my own hands in different poses, and gained a better understanding of the joints, how they bend, their limits, and so on, not only did I feel less dependent on references to be able to draw them, I also felt more confident in my ability to depict those references accurately in my own work because I knew why they looked right in the reference and therefore knew how to make them look right in my art. And really, as I've said far too many times now, because rambling and repeating myself is really 90% of what I do on this channel, that's what all of this comes down to. Asking why, not how, when consulting any kind of artistic reference material, whether that be a tutorial or visual reference. Because ultimately, understanding why something looks right will also teach you how to draw it right. Understanding how to draw it right in one setting will not teach you why it looks right. It's like that old saying, give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime. Tutorials and references are no different. Consult one reference to draw a hand in one setting, and you'll learn how to draw one hand in one setting. Learn why hands look how they do based on an understanding of anatomy, and you'll learn how to draw a hand in any setting. Next time you're drawing a new piece, consider your process. If someone stopped you at any point and asked you, why are you drawing that way? Would you have an answer? If not, it might warrant some reconsideration of your own utilization of references and tutorials that may have led you to draw it that way in the first place. Because the fundamental understanding necessary to maximize the benefits of that utilization might be lacking. There is nothing wrong with imitation when it comes to artistic growth, it's how we all learn, so long as the understanding necessary to properly implement it isn't missing. And that's something you can absolutely avoid by staying consciously aware of the way that you're studying, drawing, and approaching art altogether. The shortcuts of tutorials may be tempting, but using them without understanding why they work might be holding you back from improving past a certain threshold. Copying a reference might enable you to draw it accurately, but doing so without any understanding of why it looks how it does might be limiting your ability to draw that subject matter in any setting outside of the reference you're consulting. But if you ask yourself the whys and not just the hows, and use references and tutorials as supplemental tools rather than substitutes for the development of fundamental skills, you can instead empower yourself to take your art to the next level in new, even endless ways. It's not about the tools you're using, it's about the way you approach them. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. Special thank you as always to channel members Joseph Solomon, TC Pratt, Zelda Deverak 42, Abyss Reborn, Haruki Kyle, Kinga James, Cutie Sailor Love Lovely, Inside Chaos, CP Lil Thing, and Art of Amethyst Fable, as well as patrons Batman, Kyle Lowe, Blue Swanson, Cora Fear, Jamisha Walker, Alengshi, Kim Yen, Crazy Asar, Gentong, Grayson Xavier, MG, Blah Mage, TC Pratt, Finn, Grim Spectre, Celine Merriman, Ash, Eldritchia, The Stray Dog, Ulura, Greg Noble, Decagon, Jenny Chan, Captain Reku, Ryan M. Williams, Cat Bus, Alec Reinakainen, Mac, Lucy Yamajiki, Selena Bibi, Electamike, Pryday, Totally Shogun, Insomniac Sleep Schedule, Lola the Pinky, Wing Wong, and Smiley Boy, and I'll see you in the next one.